Here is the revised version with very slight wording changes. Same length, no headings, and simple English, while keeping the story and flow intact. A 1902 studio photograph was recovered, and historians were left speechless after the image was enhanced. The photograph arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society inside a worn leather portfolio donated by an estate sale coordinator who had discovered it hidden inside a decaying Victorian desk. The portfolio itself seemed ordinary, brown in color, cracked along the edges, with brass clasps dulled by years of neglect. But when archivist David Morrison carefully opened it and saw the studio portrait inside, something made him stop. The image showed a well-dressed couple standing inside a photographer's studio, the kind of formal portrait commonly taken in Boston around the turn of the century. The man wore a dark suit with a stiff high collar, his mustache neatly groomed. One hand rested protectively on the shoulder of a young girl standing between the adults. The woman beside him wore an elaborate dress trimmed with lace, her expression calm, almost unnaturally calm. The child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, stared straight into the camera with wide, serious eyes. David had examined thousands of photographs from this period. Most of them told simple stories, families recording their lives, their success, their place in society. But something about this photograph felt different. The studio backdrop showed painted columns and flowing draped fabric, typical of 1902 portrait studios. The photographer's mark was embossed in the corner, J.P. Whitmore Studio, Boston, Mass. David placed the photograph beneath the magnifying lamp on his desk, adjusting the light to study the details more closely. The couple's clothing suggested wealth. The fabrics looked expensive, the tailoring precise and carefully done. But as David continued to study the image, his trained eye began to notice small inconsistencies. The woman's posture appeared stiff, almost posed too carefully. The man's smile did not quite reach his eyes. And the child, there was something about the way she held herself, a tension in her small body that felt unusual for a normal family portrait. David made a note to research the Whitmore studio archives. There might be records of sitting books with names and dates. He photographed the portrait with his digital camera, capturing every detail, then gently returned the original to its acid-free protective sleeve. As he uploaded the image to his computer, preparing to enhance and catalog it, David felt the familiar spark of curiosity that had drawn him to archival work in the first place. Every photograph was a window into the past, but some windows revealed more than others. This one, he suspected, might hold a story worth uncovering. He did not yet know how right he was, or how deeply that story would challenge everything historians believed about this seemingly ordinary family portrait. 3 days later, David sat in the digital restoration lab with Emma Chen, the Society's imaging specialist. Emma had spent 15 years working with historical photographs, pulling details from faded daguerreotypes and damaged tintypes that appeared beyond saving. She approached each image like a forensic investigator, revealing layers invisible to the naked eye. "This one is in surprisingly good condition," Emma said, adjusting her glasses as the high-resolution scan appeared on her screen. The studio used quality materials. The gelatin silver print has aged well. David pulled a chair beside her. "I want to see everything, the clothing, the jewelry, the studio props, anything that could help identify these people." Emma's fingers moved across the keyboard as she applied filters and adjustments. The image sharpened, contrast increased, and shadows lifted to expose hidden details. She zoomed in on the woman's hands, folded neatly at her waist. The lace on the dress became sharp, with individual threads now visible. Then she shifted her focus to the jewelry. "Look at this," Emma said, her voice suddenly tight. On the child's chest, barely visible in the original print, hung a small oval locket on a thin chain. Emma enhanced the area, sharpening the image until the surface of the locket came into view. Engraved into the gold were ornate initials. "Can you read that?" David leaned closer, as Emma increased the magnification and applied another sharpening filter. The letters became clear. "M-E-R, David repeated, pulling out his notebook. "Those aren't initials that match any common Boston naming patterns from 1902 that I know." But Emma had already moved to another part of the image. She zoomed into the background where the painted columns stood. Behind them, barely noticeable, was a small table holding what appeared to be studio props, a vase, a few books, decorative items meant to be included in portraits when needed. "David, look at this," Emma said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. She enhanced a section of the table, and suddenly an object came into sharp focus. It was a small framed photograph, angled as if someone had been examining it, and set it down carelessly. The frame appeared ornate, possibly silver. Inside it was another portrait, a woman holding an infant. The image looked older and more faded. "Why would there be another family photo in the background of this one?" Emma asked. David's thoughts raced. Unless it wasn't supposed to be there. Unless the photographer didn't notice it, or someone wanted it there. As evidence, Emma finished. They stared at the screen in silence. The next morning, David was in the Society's newspaper archive, a climate-controlled room filled with digitized records from every major Boston publication dating back to the 1780s. He began with 1902, searching for reports of missing children, unusual family situations, or incidents involving the Whitmore studio. The Boston Globe social pages were filled with routine announcements, weddings, births, society events, and charitable gatherings. Business news and political updates followed. But it was in the Evening Record, a smaller paper known for crime and human interest stories, that David found his first real lead. A headline dated March 15, 1902 read, "Tragic fire claims 3 lives in South End, mother and 2 children perish." David's pulse quickened as he read. A tenement fire had broken out in the early morning hours, trapping a young mother and her 2 children on the 3rd floor. The father, a railway clerk, had been working a night shift and returned to find his home destroyed and his family gone. The victims were named as Margaret Russell, age 28, and her children, Eleanor, age 6, and infant Thomas. Margaret Eleanor Russell. Mer. David's hands shook slightly as he wrote the names down. Could the locket have belonged to Eleanor Russell? He needed to find a photograph of the family, some way to compare the child in the studio portrait with Eleanor Russell. He searched for follow-up articles and found several. The fire had devastated the neighborhood. The father, Harold Russell, was described as completely broken by grief. A public fund had been created to help pay burial costs. The Railway Workers Association had organized a memorial service. Then the trail ended. Harold Russell vanished from public records after April 1902. There was no death certificate, no later mentions in newspapers. David searched city directories, census documents, and employment records. Nothing. It was as though Harold Russell had simply disappeared. David leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. A man loses his entire family in a fire. 6 months later, a studio portrait appears showing a couple and a child wearing a locket that may carry the initials of the dead daughter. The timing felt far too exact to be random. He needed to identify the couple in the photograph, and he needed to learn what truly happened to Harold Russell. The Whitmore studio had closed in 1928, but its records were preserved by the Boston Photographic Historical Collection, located in a small archive near the waterfront. David called ahead and spoke with the curator, an elderly man named Thomas Brennan, who had spent 40 years documenting the city's photographic history. "The Whitmore sitting books aren't complete," Thomas warned when David arrived that afternoon. "There was water damage back in the 1950s, and some of the records were lost. Here is the revised versi. On very slight wording changes, same length, no headings, and simple English, while keeping the story intact. But we do have several ledgers from the early 1900s. What date are you searching for?" "Sometime in late 1902, most likely between September and November." Thomas led David to a wooden cabinet and gently removed a leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with neat handwritten entries written in fading ink. Each line listed the client's name, the date of the sitting, how many plates were exposed, and the payment received. They found the entry dated October 12, 1902. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bennett with daughter, formal family portrait, 3 plates, $5 paid in full. Charles and Catherine Bennett. David carefully copied the names. "Is there an address?" he asked. Thomas pointed to a small note written in the margin. 142 Commonwealth Avenue. That address would have been extremely prestigious in 1902. David felt the pieces starting to come together. A wealthy couple, a Back Bay address, and a formal portrait taken only months after a deadly fire that destroyed a working-class family in the South End. He needed to learn who Charles and Catherine Bennett really were, and how they came to have a child who might be Ella Lenina Russell. "Did Whitmore keep any personal notes?" David asked. "Anything beyond the basic business records?" Thomas hesitated. "There is something. Whitmore apparently kept a private journal, separate from the ledgers. It was more personal, observations about clients, notes about unusual sittings, things like that. It's incomplete." He retrieved another volume, smaller and much more worn. "We don't allow many researchers to see this. Privacy concerns, you understand?" David nodded seriously. "This is important. I believe this photograph records something significant." Thomas studied David's face for a long moment, then opened the journal to October 1902. The entries were brief and written in a looser hand than the business records. Most were simple notes about lighting or equipment, but one entry dated October 13th, the day after the Bennett sitting, was much longer. David read Whitmore's words carefully, his heart beating faster. "Yesterday's sitting continues to trouble me. The couple who gave the name Bennett arrived exactly at 2 o'clock as scheduled. The gentleman was well-dressed and polite, though visibly uneasy, checking his pocket watch often and adjusting his collar repeatedly. The lady appeared calm but distant, speaking very little. It was the child who concerned me most. She could not have been older than 6, a pretty child with dark curls. Yet she did not speak a single word during the entire session. When I tried to engage her, asking her name, her favorite toy, anything to bring out a natural expression, she only stared at me. The woman, Mrs. Bennett as she called herself, quickly explained that the child was shy and unused to strangers. But Hat, I observed, was not shyness. It was fear. The gentleman placed the child firmly between them, his hand holding her almost possessively. I noticed the woman adjust something at the child's neck, a gold locket catching the light. When she touched it, the child flinched. It was slight, but I saw it. I have photographed hundreds of families. I know the difference between a child uneasy before a camera and a child uneasy in her own situation. This was the latter. I said nothing. It is not my role to question the private matters of my clients. But as they left, the child turned back and looked at me. In that moment, I saw something in her eyes, perhaps a plea, or perhaps resignation. I cannot say. I developed the plates this morning. The portrait is technically flawless, sharp focus, balanced composition, proper exposure. But when I look at it, I see only questions. Who are these people? And why did that child seem so deeply unhappy? David read the passage 3 times. Whitmore had sensed something was wrong, something deeply unsettling, yet he had taken no action. Perhaps he had convinced himself he was mistaken, or perhaps, like many in 1902, he believed family matters were not to be interfered with. "This is extraordinary," Thomas said softly. "In all my years with these records, I've never seen Whitmore show such personal concern over a client." David photographed the journal page, making sure every word was clearly captured. Then he returned to the ledger, searching for any additional entries involving the Bennetts. There were none. They had come once, taken their portrait, and never returned. "What about the address?" David asked. 142 Commonwealth Avenue. "Can we find who lived there in 1902? Thomas led him to another section of records, property registers and city directories. The research took nearly an hour, but finally they found it. The property at 142 Commonwealth Avenue was owned by Charles Bennett, listed as a textile merchant, and his wife Catherine. They lived there from 1898 until 1904, when the property was sold. "Do we know what happened to them after 1904? David asked. Thomas checked later directories from 1905, 1906, and 1907. Charles Bennett appeared in the 1905 directory at a new address in Brooklyn, still described as a textile merchant. By 1906, his name vanished completely from Boston records. They left the city, Thomas said. Not unusual for wealthy families, but David was focused on the timing. The Bennetts had stayed in Boston for 2 years after the portrait, then suddenly left. What had happened in 1904 to cause that move? He needed to learn more about Charles and Catherine Bennett. their business, their social circles, their lives before they entered that studio with a frightened child wearing a dead girl's locket. Back in his office, David widened his investigation. If Ella Russell was truly the child in the photograph, and if Charles and Catherine Bennett had taken her after the fire, there had to be a connection. He returned to Harold Russell, the father who lost his family and then disappeared. The Railway Workers Association had listed him as a clerk. David contacted the Boston and Albany Railroad archives, requesting employment records from 1900 to 1903. The response arrived 2 days later. Harold Russell had been employed as a freight clerk from 1899 until March 1902, when he stopped reporting for work shortly after the fire. But there was another note in his file. Wages discontinued due to absence. Final payment held pending forwarding address. Never claimed. A man loses his family and leaves his job without collecting his last wages. The grief must have been crushing, David thought. But where had Russell gone? He searched hospital records, asylum admissions, even prison documents, suspecting Russell might have suffered a breakdown or committed a desperate act. Nothing. It was as if Harold Russell had simply pet out of his life and vanished. Then David had another idea. He returned to Charles Bennett's business records. Bennett was listed as a textile merchant, but what if his work involved more than retail? David requested commercial registration documents and discovered that Bennett and Associates held contracts with several major clients. One name made David's breath catch: the Boston and Albany Railroad. Bennett supplied textiles for railway car upholstery and worker uniforms. That meant regular contact with railway offices, including the freight department where Harold Russell worked. The connection existed. Bennett and Russell would have known each other, or at least crossed paths through business. But how did that lead to Bennett having Russell's daughter months after her reported death? David leaned back, building theories. The fire killed 3 people, bodies identified and buried. But what if one identification was wrong? What if, in the chaos of the fire, a mistake had been made? What if Ella Russell survived and Charles Bennett took her? The question was why, and the darker question, was it rescue or was it abduction? David's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching county medical records for any trace of Harold Russell, he found another name: Catherine Bennett. The record came from the Brooklyn Psychiatric Hospital, dated November 1903. Catherine Bennett, age 34, admitted for treatment of severe melancholia and nervous disorder. The admission notes were brief but revealing. Patient shows signs of deep guilt and emotional distress, repeatedly speaks of a child, claims child is not hers, expresses desire to confess an unspecified wrongdoing. Husband reports symptoms began approximately 1 year ago without clear cause. 1 year earlier placed the onset of Catherine's condition in late 1902, the exact time the studio portrait was taken. David requested the full medical file. It took a week to arrive, but when it did, the contents were devastating. Catherine had remained hospitalized for 7 months. Doctor's notes described a woman overwhelmed by guilt. Patient remains focused on the child she refers to only as the girl. When questioned, patient becomes distressed. States child does not belong to her. Claims husband brought the child home and insisted they present her as their own. Patient insists the child's mother is dead. Here is the revised version with very small wording changes, same length, no headings, and simple English, while keeping the story fully intact. The child should be with her rightful family. When doctors pressed for more details, the patient became incoherent, crying uncontrollably. Another entry dated January 1904 stated that the patient's husband visited that day. He dismissed the patient's statements, claiming she had suffered a miscarriage 2 years earlier and had become obsessed with the idea of adopting a child. He insisted there was no truth to her claims about a child living in their home. He appeared anxious to remove her from hospital care, saying he had arranged private treatment at a facility in New York. Catherine Bennett was transferred to a private sanatorium in upstate New York in March 1904. The trail ended there. There were no further records, no indication of what happened to her afterward. Yet her testimony, labeled as delusion by doctors and denied by her husband, matched perfectly with David's growing theory. Charles Bennett had brought a child home, insisted they raise her as their own. And when Catherine's conscience could no longer carry the lie, she had collapsed under the weight of it. David now had enough evidence to build a clear narrative. Charles Bennett, through his business connections with the railroad, had somehow learned about the Russell family fire. Perhaps he had even been present in some official or informal role, offering help. And somehow, in the confusion, he had taken Eleanor Russell, either convincing himself he was rescuing her, or simply taking advantage of the chaos to claim the child he and his wife desperately wanted. But David still needed proof. He needed to find Eleanor herself, or at least trace what became of her after 1904. The next lead came from an unexpected place. David posted a question on a genealogy forum asking if anyone had information about the Bennett family of Boston. 3 days later, he received a reply from a woman named Patricia Hughes in Connecticut. She wrote that her grandmother had attended Worthington Academy for Girls in Western Massachusetts from 1908 to 1914. She still owned a yearbook from that time and remembered seeing the name Bennett among the students. She was unsure if it was the same family, but offered to check. David replied immediately, sharing the estimated birth year. Eleanor would have been born around 1896, making her 12 in 1908, the right age to enter a boarding school. Patricia's next message included a photograph. It was a scanned yearbook page from 1912 showing graduating students. Among them was Eleanor Bennett, age 16, listed as originally from Boston, with current residence noted as New York. David's hands shook as he enlarged the image. The girl was older now, her features more mature, but there was something unmistakable in her eyes, the same serious intensity he had seen in the studio portrait, and around her neck, barely visible, was a thin chain. David contacted Worthington Academy immediately. The school had closed in 1956, but its records were preserved by the local historical society. After David explained his research, the archivist agreed to search for Eleanor Bennett's files. What arrived 2 weeks later exceeded everything David had hoped for. There were admission records, letters, and most importantly, an emergency contact form. Eleanor Bennett had been enrolled in 1908 by Charles Bennett of Albany, New York, who listed himself as her guardian, not her fath. A form included a note stating that the student's parents were deceased and that there were no other living relatives. But there was more. Tucked inside Eleanor's file was a letter dated June 1914, written in a young woman's careful handwriting. To whom it may concern, I am writing to inform the school that I will not be returning for further studies. My guardian has passed away, and I have decided to seek independent employment. I thank the faculty for their kindness during my years here. However, I must state clearly that the name I have used, Eleanor Bennett, is not my true name. My real name is Eleanor Russell. My mother was Margaret Russell, and she died in a fire in Boston in 1902. I do not know what happened in those early years, why I was taken from my father, or how I came to live under another name, but I intend to find out. I am 18 years old now, and I will discover the truth of who I am and what was done to me. David immediately began searching for Eleanor Russell after 1914. The trail was difficult. A young woman traveling alone, possibly using different names, in a time when records were inconsistent. But fragments emerged. A boarding house registry in Springfield listing an E. Russell in 1915, an employment record from a textile factory in Lowell showing Eleanor Russell hired as a clerk in 1916. Then, in the Boston City Archives, David found what he had been searching for. A legal petition filed in 1918, Eleanor Russell, age 20. 2. Was requesting access to records related to the 1902 tenement fire that had supposedly taken her life, along with the lives of her mother and infant brother. David obtained the full court file. Eleanor's petition included a sworn statement detailing everything she had uncovered about her own past. Her account was careful and heartbreaking. She remembered pieces of the fire, the smoke, her mother screaming, being carried outside by a neighbor. She remembered waking in a hospital, confused and terrified. And days later, she remembered a well-dressed man telling her that her father had died of grief, that she had no family left, and that he and his wife would care for her. That man was Charles Bennett. Over 4 years, Eleanor's investigation had revealed the truth. The fire had killed her mother and infant brother. Eleanor had survived but was badly traumatized, barely able to speak. In the chaos of the hospital, with many victims arriving at once, records were confused. A nurse, exhausted and overwhelmed, had mistakenly recorded LLR as deceased along with her family. Charles Bennett had been at the hospital offering assistance to families connected to railway workers. His company had business ties with the railroad, and he overheard discussions about the Russell tragedy. He learned that Harold Russell believed his entire family was dead and was overcome with despair. Bennett also discovered that no relatives had come forward to claim the surviving child. Bennett and his wife were unable to have children. Multiple miscarriages had devastated Catherine, and there, in the hospital, was an opportunity. A child with no one to claim her, no one who would question her disappearance into a new life. Bennett presented himself as a helpful businessman and arranged Eleanor's discharge, claiming he would take her to distant relatives. Instead, he brought her home and, over time, erased Eleanor Russell and created Eleanor Bennett. The locket bearing her mother's initials was the only link to her true identity she was allowed to keep. Perhaps Catherine insisted on it, unable to erase the truth completely. As for Harold Russell, Eleanor's petition revealed the darkest truth of all. Harold Russell had not simply vanished. In May 1902, 2 months after the fire, his body was recovered from Boston Harbor. The death was ruled a suicide. But the coroner's report noted bruising on his arms and torso, injuries not fully explained by drowning, suggesting a struggle before death. With no witnesses and clear signs of despair, no investigation followed. Eleanor argued that if her father had known she survived, he would have had reason to live. The court granted her access to all records but declined to pursue criminal charges. Charles Bennett had died in 1930. Catherine Bennett had died in the New York sanatorium in 1907, never recovering from her breakdown. There was no one left to prosecute, but Eleanor achieved something greater than justice. She reclaimed her identity. The court officially recognized her as Eleanor Russell, daughter of Harold and Margaret Russell, and granted her access to her father's unclaimed wages and small estate. David found one final record. Eleanor Russell married in 1920, moved to Providence, Rhode Island, and lived until 1968. She spent decades working as an advocate for orphaned children, helping establish rules and oversight for adoption to prevent tragedies like her own. When David presented his research to the Historical Society, the studio portrait revealed its full meaning. It was not a family portrait. It was proof of an abduction, a crime captured in plain sight, preserved by a photographer who sensed something was wrong but did not know how to act. Emma enhanced the image one last time. The locket with Margaret Russell's initials, the tension in Eleanor's small body, the guilt already visible in Catherine Bennett's stiff posture, the calculation in Charles Bennett's hand resting on the child's shoulder. This photograph, David told the audience, is a testament to resilience. Eleanor Russell lived much of her childhood as someone else, but she never lost herself. And when she was old enough, she fought to reclaim her name and protect others from the same fate. What once looked like an ordinary portrait, a wealthy couple with their daughter in a Boston studio, revealed a story of loss, deception, and determination. Eleanor Russell had been taken, renamed, and nearly erased from history. But she survived. She remembered. And she made sure her truth would not be forgotten. The photograph remains on display at the Historical Society, accompanied by a full plaque explaining Eleanor's story. Visitors pause, study the image, and see what the photographer saw in 1902. A child who did not belong, a family that was not a family, and a moment of deep injustice captured forever in silver and light.